Bevor wir jetzt beginnen, möchte ich noch ganz kurz, ich weiß nicht, ob jemand da ist von der amerikanischen Botschaft, denn die haben das möglich gemacht, dass Susan Ray heute Abend auch anwesend sein können wird. Ohne die wäre das nicht möglich gewesen und denen möchte ich noch ganz herzlich an dieser Stelle danken. Und ich übergebe jetzt an Andrew Grant, wir haben das zusammen organisiert und er wird eine ganz kurze Einführung geben zum Film und Susan Ray vorstellen. Dann viel Vergnügen.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Andrew Grant, co-programmer of the Festival of Unknown Pleasures this year. I just want to tell you a little bit about how the film arrived at this festival. I met Susan Ray in New York about 2 or 3 years ago, before We Can't Go Home Again was restored. Susan was trying very actively to get the film restored, and I was working with a gentleman at the time who was doing digital restoration, and we had a very good meeting with Susan in New York City, and then a few months later, actually, I met with her up in her home in Woodstock, and we talked a lot more about the project. And though I didn't wind up working on the restoration, it did happen thanks to the Venice Film Festival and others. But we kept in contact, and when I moved to Berlin, I told her I would love nothing more than to present the German premiere of the film, and she agreed. And I'm really, really honored to be presenting this film tonight.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm sorry I can't address you in your language. I'm very happy to be here. I haven't been in Berlin since the 60s, a long time ago, and it's a very different place now. I've heard from my friends, and I can see that it's one of the liveliest places for artists really in the West, so you're very lucky, and I feel very lucky to be here. Before you watch the film, I'd like to tell you a few things about it, if I may. First, how it was made and what you're going to see. What you're seeing is not a finished film. By the director's own standards, it's not finished. It was shot when Nick was teaching in a university, upstate New York, and it was his conviction that you cannot teach film without making a film, that to learn how to make a film, you have to have the hands-on experience. So he started out with this class that he'd never met before, and he had a system by which they would alternate positions on the crew. One person would be on camera for 2 weeks, one person on lights, one person on costuming, one person on sound, and then they'd all switch, so that by the end of the rotation, they'd all have the experience of each position, and they'd know the problems of each position, and they'd also know how to move in each position in a collaborative way. Nick was very keen on film as a collaborative enterprise. So many of the students, when the shooting began, which was the night of the first meeting of the class, many of them had never held a camera before, and they weren't quite sure which end was the lens. So you'll see, the footage you're going to see is often very rough. These are students learning, and you're going to watch the film that is, among other things, the process of their education. As Nick got to know the students better, and they got to know him, and they were working around the clock, often for 3 and 4 days at a stretch without sleep, they, needless to say, got very well acquainted. And so their stories began to, their lives and their stories began to intertwine, and that became the substance of the film. The student stories, and also Nick's story as a film director who had left Hollywood of his own volition, to explore the adventure of filmmaking along with the adventure of living, which he found was no longer possible in Hollywood. And a little side story, when Nick was shooting 55 Days at Peking in Spain, he woke up with a premonition that he would never finish another film. And so his storyline in this film is that of a director trying to overcome this premonition by completing a film. So those are the two contrapuntal themes, if you will. There's also in the backdrop a theme of that particular moment in United States history when Western history, cultural history, when the students were retiring, they were moving back from the confrontation, the political confrontations of the 60s, into a kind of self-inquiry, and as one of the students says, we want to do our own thing. So this was a very critical turning point. The students who made this film are now the same age that Nick was when he was teaching them. And so there's an interesting piece of material in there that I'll talk about in just a second. I want to tell you a little bit also about the restoration. This is not what's called a pristine restoration, where every scratch is removed and it's all neat and tidy and it looks like a brand new film, because this film never looked like a brand new film. You'll see grease pencil, you'll see scratches, you'll see splice marks. That's all part of the process of these kids learning their craft. Now, you'll also see that this is a film shot frequently in multiple image. There are 3 and 4 and 5 images on the screen at one time, because, as Nick would say, we don't think in straight lines. So if you're going to try and follow a straight line narrative, you're going to have a hard time. This is a film that gets better with repeated viewings as you begin to pick up different aspects of it. The storylines, yes. The colors, if you just sit back and watch the colors go by, you'll have a very good time, because it's very beautiful from that perspective. The multiple image was a technique that Nick devised. Actually, if you look at his earlier films, his Hollywood films even, you'll see traces of it. You'll see the seeds of it. It was an approach to filmmaking that he always wanted to explore. He did a lot of experiments with it in the 60s when he was in Belgrade. And this was his chance, with a student crew and no money, to really play and see what the form was capable of. He used to say that no one knows what film is capable of. We haven't even touched it yet. So he was playing with that. And so you're seeing an experiment in process. You're seeing a process more than a completed goal. And I hope you can let yourself relax into that without looking. It's a little bit more work. It's definitely a film that's going to challenge you, I can promise you that, but I think in a very good way. And I just want to pose some questions to you. These are the questions that I held in addressing the restoration and in making the documentary, because I wanted to, in restoring the film, I wanted to be as respectful as possible of what Nick's real intentions were. And I wasn't clear on all of them. So I went through, Nick had an uncanny habit of recording every conversation he had. And so I went through all these recordings, and they supplied all the answers to my questions in Nick's own words and voice. Most of them, anyway. One of the questions that I posed to you is whether you think this is a film that could ever be finished, whether it should be finished, and if it should be finished, how could it be finished, given that these students moved on. A lot of them graduated before the film was completed. Also, in making this film, Nick, I'm told that this is not a positive word among filmmakers nowadays. He called it the journalistic film. I understand that's not a good word, but let's call it an ethnographic film. He wanted to document the manners, the mores, the everyday habits of these young people, with an understanding or a belief that what he was seeing in the political system at that time was that there was such a gap between, for instance, these kids and those in power, and that the people in power were no longer identifiable. They had removed themselves from all accountability. And it was Nick's belief that by documenting everyday lives, one could counteract the kind of reality gap that's created by an invisible power structure. So that's another question, if you will, to examine, is how this particular moment when kids were withdrawing into themselves after feeling, in a sense, overpowered, they moved away from the confrontation with a sense of failure, the political confrontation with a sense of failure. So how that manifests among these kids. I see there are a lot of you in this audience of my generation, which is their generation, and so I'd be interested in how you identify with that. And the final question I had, and we can talk about this later, was how the kids think about this experience now, 40 years later, and I'd be happy to share that with you later. But now I should let the film speak for itself. I hope you enjoy it, however you look at it, and I can promise you a good ride. Thank you.